Now we will be getting to grips with basic UV manipulation that is useful in creating procedural materials. We have already learned that the UV value for the current pixel on the screen is used to look up into a texture to sample its value. Unreal Engine provides a way to intercept the UV value and change it before the texture is sampled. The texture sample nodes provide an input that allows us to change which UV value is used to look up the texture for any pixel. Unreal provides a UV coordinate node, which we can use in conjunction with the UV input on the texture node to give us a hook into the UV value before the texture is sampled. What happens when this is plugged into the UV slot on the texture is that the values generated by this node will be sampled by the UVs on the mesh, and the result of that will be used as the new UVs in the final texture sample. The node by itself just provides gradients that go from 0 to 1, one in the red channel horizontally and one in the green channel vertically. You can see this if we use a component mask to isolate the channels. So an unmodified UV coordinate node acts as an identity value, which means that if you plug this into the UV coordinate slot of the texture sample, then the UVs are not changed and the texture will be sampled as usual. One of the mathematical operations which we will need here is vector addition. A vector is one or more components bundled together, where each component represents the distance along some axis. In this case, our UV values are 2D vectors, which represent the position in the texture we're going to sample in both the U and V directions. Vectors are usually interpreted as distance from the origin, which is the coordinate 0, 0. If we take another vector, then that vector is also defined as being relative to the origin. So what does adding vectors together actually mean? The rules for adding vectors state that we simply add the vector together component-wise, so the first components add together individually, and also the second components add together. You can see from the resulting vector that it's like taking the second vector and placing it onto the end of the first. This is useful because we can take our UVs, and by adding a constant vector, we can shift them all by a certain amount. Then when our texture is sampled, then it will sample the pixels with an offset. One interesting thing is that when it comes to addition, it doesn't matter which way round you add them together, you will get the same result. Now we've seen this ability to provide this new UV input, and we have seen what the UV addition is actually doing, let's see this in action in Unreal. So here we are in Unreal, and I'm in an empty map, and I'm going to come to my Content Materials folder and create a new material. So right click and create a new material, and I'm going to call this UV Addition. So I'm going to open up this material, and here we are in the material editor, and I'm going to create a texture sample node. So if I right click and type text, then texture sample will be the highlighted one, and we can place that down. And since we have the starter content installed, I'm going to choose the bush texture as a texture that we can use to see how the UV addition works to offset this texture. And we can see on this node, it's got the UV slot, and this is what we're going to be using to hook into the UV system to add our offset. So if we pull off this pin and we start typing text, we can see texture coordinate is the node that we want. So we'll click on that and place it down. And to make this a bit clearer, we're going to give a bit of space here. We're going to turn the preview into a plane. And then we're going to right click on the texture sample node and say start previewing node. And that will display the result of this on the plane. So let's open up this texture coordinate node. And we can see that here it's just providing the default gradients in the horizontal and vertical direction. And since the texture coordinate node outputs a 2D vector, we can add another 2D vector onto this. So if we hold 2 on the keyboard and click on the canvas, then we get this 2D vector node with a default value of 0, 0. Now to add this to the texture coordinate values, you hold the A key to create an add node, click on the canvas, and now we can connect the output of the texture coordinate node to the first input, and this 2D vector to the second input, and the result of this add node will be the addition of these two 2D vectors. Now if we add 0, 0, then we're not adding anything to the UVs, and by plugging this into the texture, then we don't get any change. But now if we add an offset of 0.25, then we see that this texture has shifted left by a quarter. The reason it's a quarter is because the UVs go from 0 to 1, and 0.25 is a quarter of 1, so it shifts left in UV space. So we're seeing this region on the right that has the texture wrapping round from the left-hand side. And the reason for that is because of the sampling mode on the texture sample node. So if we click on this and come to its properties, we can see there's a sampler source, and we can change that to clamp. And this is illustrating what's happening. So what we're seeing here is that any U value that has gone above 1 gets clamped to 1, and it samples the same pixel along the edge. If we set this to negative 0.25, then we'll see it happening in the other direction, where anything below 0 is getting clamped to 0, and then sampling that leftmost pixel and repeating it across the mesh. And we could do this in the vertical direction as well. If we add 0.25, then the texture is going to shift up, and any V value that is above 1 gets clamped, and will sample that bottom pixel and repeat it down. So now we can see what the other mode does. If we select the texture sample node, and we come over to the sampler source, and turn this to wrap, and we can see that any of the UV values that go above or below 0 just wrap around into the next 0 to 1 range. You might be confused as to why when we subtract from the U values that it shifts to the right, and when we add it shifts to the left, but the same doesn't happen for the V values. And the reason for that is we can see when we set this back to 0, 0, and we get our default texture, when we add a value, let's go back to 0.25, then the right hand side has gone above 1, so we'll wrap around and start from 0 and go to 0.25. And the reason that it doesn't happen for the V values is because the coordinate starts in the top left hand corner and increases downwards. So when we add to the V values, we can see that it does indeed shift up. If you wanted to work around this, we could create another 2D vector and set this to the value -1 and 1, and then we can multiply this against this 2D vector. So we hold M on the keyboard and left click, and then we multiply these two together. Then what we're effectively doing is we're inverting the U value. So now when we plug this in, we can see that a positive value of 0.25 shifts it up and to the right by the amount that you expect. And that also works in the negative direction as well. So if we set this to -0.25, -0.25, then we can see we've shifted down and to the left by a quarter. So that covers what happens when we use addition to manipulate UVs. Next we'll see how we can use multiplication.